Hello everyone. So, today I wish to explain how to use WebListeners. What is WebListener? Web container events including session creation, attribute inserting, passivation and activation are monitored using Servlet listeners. Events are generated by the Servlet container and force the behavior of event listener classes. The scope of these events might be either at the request, session or application level. All of the listeners associated with a given application are configured by the web container at the time of deployment. Using the feature of listener introduced in Servlet, we can make a web application which responds to events taking place in a web application. These events can be of request, session or application level scope. To use Servlet listener, first listener class must be made ready by implementing the corresponding listener interface. Second, the prepared listener class must be mapped using Web Xml mapping or annotation-based mapping. This is an example for Web Xml mapping. This is an example for Web Listener mapping. Servlet listener is used for listening to events in a web container, such as when you create a session or place an attribute in a session, or if you passivate and activate in another container. To subscribe to these events, you can configure listener in web.xml. For example, HTTP session listener. Listeners get irrigated for an actual physical request that can be attached to events in your app server. With listeners, you can track application level, session level, lifecycle changes, attribute changes, and etc. You can monitor and react to events in the Servlet lifecycle by defining listener object. Those methods get invoked when lifecycle events occur. Type of listeners. Major three types of listeners: Servlet context, Servlet request, HTTP session. Servlet context divided two methods: Servlet context listener, Servlet context attribute listeners. Servlet request divided two listeners: Servlet request listener, Servlet request attribute listeners. HTTP session divided four listeners: HTTP session listeners, HTTP session attribution listener, HTTP session binding listener, HTTP session attribute listener. Context listeners. Servlet context listener. This interface listens to the Servlet context event. When Servlet context is initialized or destroyed, Servlet context listener gives notification. Servlet context listener defines two methods. First one is context initialize. Method execute when an application being deployed. This is an example for that. It is override method. Second one is void context destroyed. Method executed when application is being destroyed. This is an example for that, and it's also overridden method. Servlet context attribute listener. This interface listener to the session context attribute event. When any object is added, removed or replaced from Servlet context, it gives a notification. Servlet context attribute listener defines three methods. First one is attribute added. Method notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the Servlet context. This is an example for that. The second one is attribute removed. Method notified whenever the attribute is removed from the Servlet context. This is for example for that. Third one is attribute replaced. Attribute replaced method notifies whenever the attribute gets replaced on the servlet context. This is an example for that. Request listeners. Servlet request listener. This interface listens to servlet request event when request is created or destroyed. It gives a notification. Servlet request listener defines two methods. First one is void request initialized. This method is executed when request is initialized. This is an example for that, and this is an override method. Second one is void request destroyed. This method is executed when request is destroyed. This is an example. Second one is servlet request attribute listener. This interface listener to servlet request attribute event. When any object is added, removed, or replaced from request, it gives out a notification. Servlet request attribute listener defines three methods. First one is attribute added. It notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the request. This is a code example for that. Attribute removed. If notifies whenever the attribute is removed from the request. This is code example for that. Attribute replaced. It notifies whenever the attribute gets replaced on the request. This is code example for that. Session listeners. HTTP session listener. This interface listens to HTTP session event. When session is created or destroyed, it gives a notification. HTTP session listener defines two methods. First one is void session created. This method is executed when session is created. This is code example for that. It is a override method. Second one is void session destroyed method. This method is executed when session is destroyed. This is code example. Second one is HTTP session attribute listener. This interface listener to HTTP session binding event. When any object is added, removed, or replaced from session, it gives a notification. HTTP session attribute listener defines three methods. First one is attribute added. This method notifies whenever a new attribute is added to the session. Second one is attribute removed. This method notifies whenever the attribute is removed from the session. This is code example. Attribute replaced. This method notifies whenever the attribute gets replaced on the session. This is code example. It is a override method. HTTP session binding listener. By implementing this interface, objects themselves can learn whenever they have been added to or withdrawn from a session. HTTP session binding listener listens to HTTP session binding event and define following method. Value bound. This method notifies about object when object is added to session. Second one is value unbound. This method notifies when object is removed from session. HTTP session activation listener. When a session object is moved from one virtual machine to another, the HTTP session activation listener interface is invoked to listen for changes in the state of the session. HTTP session activation listener only has any relevance when a session is part of a web application in a distributed environment. Therefore, it is not possible to provide an example. HTTP Session Activation Listener Interface defines two methods. First one is session did activate. This method is executed when session has activated. Session will passivate. This method will execute when session is about to passivate. Thank you.